Greetings, wise acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the Archives. Darth Plagueis was certainly one of the most fascinating Sith to ever come from the Order's history. His views on the galaxy and the Jedi, as well as on the Force itself, have been in opposition to almost every other being that existed before Plagueis. Darth Plagueis was a man who absolutely rejected the notion that the Force was a mystery, stating that it is only a mystery to those who are too weak to interfere with it or seek out the whole truth, deeming these Sith that refuse to do so inferior. His denigration of the mystical side of the Force has stoked the ire of many scholars of the Force, including his own apprentice, Insidious. In the past, we have recorded holocrons about his wild experiments, and how at one point, the Force came to outright hate Darth Plagueis. In all honesty, it is highly unlikely that anyone truly cared much for Darth Plagueis besides his droid, 114D, and that's probably a product of Plagueis' rather dry and radical takes on the Force itself, and what and how the Sith should represent themselves. This brings us to the topic of today's video. Among several of the Dark Scientist's most controversial statements, there exists one that implies that Plagueis actually looks down on Sith that began as Jedi. He goes as far to imply that the Jedi who turned to the dark side and became Sith are merely pretenders, and that they don't fully understand the dark side since they didn't embrace it from the very beginning. For this analysis, we invite you to come along with us as we examine the words of Darth Plagueis and try to break down his point of view to see if there's actually any truth in it. So now, without further ado, let us open this holocron and begin. The whole source of today's video comes from a quote from the Darth Plagueis novel. The quote goes as follows: "Propelled by fear or hatred, even a Jedi can pass beyond the constraints of the Order's teachings and discover power of a more profound sort. But no Jedi who arrives at this place, who has risen above his or her allegiance to peace and justice, who kills in anger or out of desire, can lay real claim to the dark side of the Force. Their attempts to convince themselves that they fell to the dark side, or that the dark side compelled their actions, are nothing more than pitiful rationalizations. That is why the Sith embraced the dark from the start, focusing on the acquisition of power. We make no excuses. The actions of a Sith begin from the self and flow outwards. We stalk the Force like hunters, rather than surrender like prey to its enigmatic whims." End quote. So, right here we have quite a loaded statement. Plagueis is saying in effect that the Jedi who have suddenly tapped into the dark side by letting their emotions out haven't actually found the dark side, but rather are dancing on the very edge. He means exactly what he says: power of a more profound sort for true Sith. We are fairly certain that we understand what Plagueis means by this statement, as he isn't yet referring to the Jedi that have committed to the study of the dark side, but merely those who have used their emotions with the Force and achieved more power by sheer accident and by falling upon the dark side. For a good example of this, look no further than Obi-Wan Kenobi in The Phantom Menace, when Obi-Wan was suddenly emboldened by the death of Qui-Gon to tap into his emotional reserves and give Maul a real challenge. His emotions did blind him though, and he was pushed off the edge into the reactor shaft. But then, he was able to once again call upon his emotion and the Force in order to leap out and slice Maul in half. Kenobi was certainly using his anger in this moment, but I am still skeptical to say that he was actually using the dark side. In that moment, he gave himself over to the feelings of loss and pain of his master whom he loved, and whom he loved like a father, and was gutted right in front of him. Obi-Wan got dangerously close to the dark side in this moment, but managed to refrain from going all the way in. In fact, even Obi-Wan himself later says that his biggest pull to the dark side was actually against a group of Tusken Raiders, not against Darth Maul. Anyway, other Jedi who have experienced something similar, that being giving into emotion for a brief moment only to discover a sudden burst of power, all believe that they have suddenly fallen to the dark side, and this is simply not true, and this is something that we agree with Plagueis on, and something that frankly enrages Plagueis. The Dark Lord is saying that these beliefs are pitiful rationalizations so that they won't have to face the reality that their teachings are holding the Jedi back. Plagueis then goes on to talk about how the Sith have embraced power from the very start by simply dropping all pretense about the situation and admitting to just being selfish and being perfectly happy with the fact that they are dark side creatures. But I think it is simply the way that he talks about how they embrace the dark side from the start and focusing on the acquisition of power, and then that they make no excuses. This tells us that there is more going on in the mind of Darth Plagueis than what he is actually saying, so let's explain what we mean by this. What we stated a moment ago about what Plagueis said regarding Jedi who dipped into higher power is certainly true, but but I think that Plagueis is actually double speaking here. He may be referring to Jedi like this, but the undertones of what he is saying reveal something much deeper, a hidden contempt for Sith who began as Jedi. So why exactly do we say this? Well, think about what Plagueis said. We embrace the dark from the start. We make no excuses. He's throwing a very subtle insult at Sith who began as Jedi, basically saying that their sob stories and tragic backstories are something that they use as an excuse and a rationalization for dipping into the dark side and ultimately becoming Sith. Plagueis finds them to be inferior since they didn't embrace the dark side from the start. Perhaps he believed Jedi who become Sith are simply lying to themselves and are wanting to appear more noble than they actually are, a trait carried over from their beginnings as Jedi. To many, their perspective can come off as pretty unfair and even callous, but we have to remember what Darth Plagueis is actually saying, and who Darth Plagueis is. Plagueis comes from the prestigious Moon species, a people whose entire culture is built upon class, not to mention status, wealth, and elitism. Moons, and Plagueis especially, tend to look down on every other creature. These vain habits cause Plagueis' ego to become quite inflated, to the point that he starts to adhere to these ideas, and ideas such as this, that those who were born into the darkness, those who didn't drop everything and accept it from the start, were somehow inferior. Here's another thing we have to remember about Plagueis though. Plagueis was literally born to be a Sith. His master, Darth Tenebris, actually had sought out two of the most promising Force-sensitive specimens with a high enough midichlorian count, a male and a female Moon from the Damask family. Tenebris manipulated them into getting together so that they could bear a child for him to claim as his apprentice. Plagueis was a bred Sith. This plan worked out flawlessly, and they produced an heir who they named Higo Damask, who Tenebris stole from childhood and trained in the ways of the dark side for him to eventually become Darth Plagueis. From this story, it becomes glaringly clear that Plagueis has a superiority complex, believing that because he had been chosen by darkness from the very beginning, he was destined to be the greatest Sith that has ever lived. He did not fall upon this, he was born into it. This is likely why we hear so many of the controversial and egotistical statements from him. He had assumed that he was going to be the last Sith anyway, so it didn't really matter what he thought about the Sith beforehand. Perhaps Plagueis also rationalized this, since the Jedi who fell to Sithhood wasn't a Sith from the beginning, and they might have had a lot of bias and baggage carried over from their time as Jedi. But of course, the problem here is that Plagueis is verifiably dead wrong. Almost every single Jedi that ever became a Sith was one of the most successful and feared Sith in the entire order. Exar Kun, who Plagueis himself had mentioned once earlier with reverence, was a Jedi starting out, and he nearly brought the galaxy to its knees. He killed the Supreme Chancellor in broad daylight, destroyed the Jedi's homeworld, and was one of the greatest Sith sorcerers that have ever lived. Revan and Malak did far more for the Sith Order as a whole than many Sith Lords did back in the day. It was from them carrying over their Jedi understandings, and the Jedi understandings of a master and apprentice relationship that would spawn Bane's idea for the Rule of Two. Darth Ruin was a Jedi who caused the Fourth Great Schism, which would kickstart the entirety of the new Sith Wars, which lasted for thousands of years. The Sith Order as a whole was built upon the foundations laid by Dark Jedi, who left the Order during the Second Great Schism in the year 6900 BBY, and we need not go on. But the evidence here is overwhelming, to the contrary of what Plagueis actually assumes. In fact, we recorded a holocron not long ago about why Jedi who became Sith were actually often more powerful. Either way, Darth Plagueis had many radical ideas that are perhaps up for debate, but this specific argument made by the egotistical Plagueis, in our opinion, can be easily refuted. However, we want to know what you think about this, and what are your thoughts on the matter? Could Darth Plagueis actually be correct here? Do you think that Plagueis had basis for this statement, or do you think that he had the complete wrong idea? Let us know down below, and as always my friends, may the Force be with you, and we hope to see you in the archives soon.